Imagine stepping into a world where kings ruled with divine right, their bloodline whispered to hold secrets so powerful, even the church trembled. This is the shadowy realm of the Merovingians, the first dynasty to unite the fractured tribes of the Franks under a single crown. A family so enigmatic, their true story has been buried beneath centuries of myth and manipulation. History remembers them as long-haired monarchs, their reigns shrouded in tales of magic, murder, and lost relics. But what if the truth is even stranger? What if the Merovingians weren't just kings, but guardians of something far older, far darker than the history books dare to admit? These rulers didn't just inherit a throne, they forged an empire from the ashes of Rome's collapse, carving out a kingdom that would one day become modern France. Yet their legacy is a puzzle wrapped in riddles. Chronicles speak of their uncanny healing powers, their refusal to cut their hair, a symbol of sacred authority, and their sudden, violent falls from grace. Some say they were touched by the divine, others insist they bargained with forces beyond mortal understanding. Even their name, Merovingian, carries an air of mystery, echoing like a whisper from the depths of the past. Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on these forgotten kings. Forget the dry dates and battles you were taught in school. We're diving into the untold chronicles, the scandals, the prophecies, the whispered alliances that shaped Europe's destiny. From the rise of Clovis, the ruthless warrior king who baptized an empire in blood, to the tragic downfall of Dagobert II, murdered under circumstances so bizarre they still spark conspiracy theories today. This isn't just history, it's a tapestry of power, faith, and secrets that refuse to stay buried. So light a candle, lean in close, and let's unravel the mysteries of the Merovingians together. The truth is waiting. Of all the treasures lost to history, none carries the weight of legend quite like the crown of Clovis I. Forged in the fires of a new empire, this wasn't just a symbol of power, it was whispered to be a vessel of divine favor. Chronicles from the time describe it as no ordinary circlet of gold, but an artifact shimmering with strange inscriptions, its jewels said to pulse with an otherworldly light. Some claimed it granted the king visions, others swore it could heal wounds with a touch. But when Clovis took his last breath in the year 511, the crown vanished without a trace, as if the earth itself had swallowed it whole. Theories about its fate spiral into the realm of the extraordinary. One persistent legend says the crown was hidden by Clovis's own descendants, passed down through shadowy channels to protect it from those who would misuse its power. Medieval whispers point to the Knights Templar, those enigmatic warrior monks, as its secret guardians, a tantalizing link between Merovingian mysticism and the later legends of the Holy Grail. Yet darker tales suggest rival factions, fearing its influence, shattered the crown into fragments, scattering them across Europe to ensure no single ruler could ever wield its power again. But what if the truth is even stranger? Could the crown have been something far older than the Merovingians themselves? Some scholars point to its unusual design, unlike any Frankish craftsmanship of the time, raising eerie parallels to artifacts from ancient Babylon or even Atlantis. Perhaps Clovis didn't create it but inherited it, a relic of a forgotten civilization hidden in plain sight. Whatever its origins, one thing is certain. The loss of the crown marked the beginning of the Merovingians' decline, as if their divine mandate had been severed with its disappearance. To this day, treasure hunters and historians alike chase shadows, hoping to uncover the final resting place of the most enigmatic crown in history. King Childebert I sat at the height of his power when death came for him, not on the battlefield but at his own banquet table. The feast should have been a celebration of his latest victories, the hall alive with music and the clatter of goblets. Yet by dawn, the king lay writhing in agony, his body racked with convulsions as froth stained his beard. The physicians could do nothing. By midday, he was dead, Such was the fate of a Merovingian king who'd ruled for nearly 4 decades, cut down not by an enemy's sword, but by treachery hiding in plain sight. The culprit, a chalice of wine laced with something far deadlier than grapes. Suspicion fell first on his queen, Ultragotha, a woman history paints with conflicting brushes. Some chronicles call her devoted, others whisper of her simmering rage after years of Childebert's infidelities. Then there were the nobles, ambitious men who'd chafed under the king's tight grip on power. In the Merovingian court, poison was the weapon of choice for those who dared not strike openly. No messy swords, no witnesses, just a silent, deniable end. The aftermath plunged the kingdom into chaos. Without a clear heir, factions scrambled like vultures, tearing at the carcass of Childebert's realm. His death wasn't just murder, it was a spark in a powder keg of rivalries that had been building for generations. What makes this story so haunting isn't just the act itself, but how perfectly it captures the brutal calculus of Merovingian politics: trust no one. Watch every cup. Even a king's feast could be his last supper, and perhaps the most chilling detail of all, the name of that fatal goblet has vanished from history as if the truth itself was poisoned. Queen Fredegund's name still drips with infamy centuries after her death, a woman so ruthless, even her rivals trembled at the whispers of her plots. But beneath the tales of poison and daggers lies something far more unsettling. A prophecy about her son's fate so precise it chills the blood. When her child, Clothar II, was just an infant, Fredegund allegedly foretold he would rule for only 16 winters before meeting a grim end. At the time, it seemed like the desperate words of a mother clinging to power. Yet when Clothar died exactly 16 years into his reign, struck down by a sudden fever, even the most skeptical chroniclers paused. Was this dark queen merely orchestrating another scheme, or had she glimpsed something beyond mortal understanding? Fredegund's life was a masterclass in manipulation. She clawed her way from servant to queen, leaving a trail of bodies in her wake: rival nobles, inconvenient spouses, even her own stepchildren. Some historians argue the prophecy was no more than a calculated ruse, a way to bind her court's loyalty through fear. If her son's reign was doomed from the start, any misfortune could be spun as fate rather than her own machinations. Yet others point to the eerie accuracy of her prediction. The Merovingian court teemed with seers and mystics, and Fredegund was said to keep company with shadowy figures who practiced arts older than Christianity. Could she have traded in more than just poisons? The truth may lie somewhere in the murk between ambition and the uncanny. Merovingian rulers lived and died by omens, dreams interpreted as divine warnings, ravens spotted before battles, priests murmuring over entrails. In such a world, even the most hardened schemer might halfway believe their own prophecies. Or perhaps Fredegund, ever the strategist, simply understood the power of a story. By weaving her son's destiny into legend, she ensured his reign, however brief, would never be forgotten. One thing is certain: in the blood-stained tapestry of the Merovingians, few threads are as haunting as the day a queen's words became a king's epitaph. Dagobert II rode through the forests of the Ardennes on a crisp autumn morning, unaware he was living his final hours. By dusk, his body would be found slumped against an ancient oak, his skull split by an assassin's axe. But the king's death wasn't the only mystery that day. His legendary treasure, a hoard rumored to contain sacred relics pillaged from Rome itself, vanished without a trace. Some say it was hidden by loyal monks in the labyrinthine catacombs beneath the Abbey of Stene. Others swear it was smuggled away by shadowy figures who'd been tracking Dagobert's movements for months. But one detail chills historians to this day. The king's final act before that fatal ride was to alter his will, leaving instructions for his gold to be returned to its rightful guardians. Who were they? The answer may lie in the treasure's origins. When Dagobert's father, Sigebert III, died under suspicious circumstances, the boy king was exiled to Ireland, a political pawn but also a student of monastic secrets. Their whispers suggest he uncovered artifacts older than Christianity, a silver casket said to hold fragments of Solomon's temple, a jeweled cross inscribed with Phoenician runes. By the time Dagobert reclaimed his throne, his coffers brimmed with objects that defied explanation. Contemporary chroniclers describe a golden cup that never emptied, a sword that glowed faintly in moonlight. Were these miracles or mere legends, the truth melted into rumor after his murder. Even the Vatican took notice, dispatching agents to recover what they called the stolen patrimony of St. Peter. Modern treasure hunters still scour the Ardennes with ground-penetrating radar and medieval maps, chasing clues as faint as candle smoke. In 2007, a farmer plowing near Stenay turned up a handful of Byzantine coins, just enough to reignite the frenzy. Then there's the eerie account from a 19th-century priest who claimed to have found a chamber beneath the abbey, its walls scrawled with Merovingian symbols before the tunnel collapsed behind him. Whether cursed or merely elusive, Dagobert's hoard has become the holy grail of lost medieval treasures. But perhaps the greatest enigma isn't where it lies, but why so many have died searching for it. A warning lingers in local folklore. The king's gold remembers its master. King Guntram's hands shook as he pressed the dagger to his palm, letting his blood drip onto the parchment below. This was no ordinary treaty. It was a pact sealed in crimson, sworn before God and his most trusted bishops to purge what he called the curse in our veins. The Merovingians had built their throne on bloodshed, from Clovis's ruthless conquests to Fredegund's poisoned cups, but Guntram, known as the Pious King, believed his family's violence had invoked a darker reckoning. Night after night, he'd wake screaming of visions, skeletal figures clutching at his children, whispers accusing his lineage of being marked. Was this divine torment or the guilt of a king who'd once ordered his own brother's execution? The bishops huddled around him that night weren't just witnesses, they were co-conspirators. Guntram's oath demanded they perform a secret rite, sprinkling holy water mixed with his blood over the tombs of his ancestors, begging absolution for sins stretching back generations. In exchange, he promised lands, gold, and protection from rival nobles. On the surface, it was a masterstroke of political theater, binding the church to his rule. But the fever in Guntram's eyes suggested something more. Chroniclers wrote of his sudden rages, his terror of thunderstorms, his insistence that his food be tasted by 3 different servants. This wasn't merely paranoia, it was the behavior of a man convinced his bloodline carried a stain. No crown. Could Chinese letter. Historians still debate whether Guntram truly believed in the curse or weaponized superstition to control his fractured kingdom. His reign was plagued by revolts, plagues, and whispers that his nephews, murdered under suspicious circumstances, haunted his halls. The blood oath gave him a weapon against dissenters. Anyone who opposed him could be framed as defying God's will. Yet private letters between bishops reveal unease. One wrote of Guntram sobbing during Mass, gripping the altar as if it might burn him. Another told of a midnight ritual where the king demanded a bishop read his blood under candlelight, seeking signs of damnation. The truth may lie in the ruins of St. Marcellus's Abbey, where Guntram's secret documents were said to be buried. Excavations in the 1800s uncovered a lead box beneath the altar, empty save for rust-colored stains and a scrap of vellum with 2 words, "Purge us." Whether the curse was real or imagined, its shadow clung to Guntram's descendants. His grandson, Childebert II, would later fall into fits, raving about the price of our birthright. Perhaps that's the most haunting legacy of the blood oath, not whether the Merovingians were truly cursed, but how thoroughly they believed they were. In the end, even kings kneel before their ghosts. The battlefield at Tolbiac lay eerily still under a full moon when the 1st century spotted them, shadows moving where no men stood. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. Soldiers swore they saw figures in ancient Frankish armor, their faces hidden beneath rusted helms, their spears glinting with spectral light. By dawn, 3 guards had deserted, babbling about whispers in a long dead tongue. These weren't ordinary phantoms, they claimed. This was the ghost army of Sigebert III, the boy king betrayed and murdered by his own nobles, now marching to reclaim his honor. Medieval chroniclers latched onto these sightings with grim fascination. The monk Richer of Rhymes wrote of entire villages near Tolbiac refusing to harvest crops from fields where the phantoms appeared, convinced the soil was cursed by restless blood. Other accounts describe strange lights flickering over the battlefield, accompanied by the distant clash of steel, though no living soul stood within miles. But what chilled readers most was the detail repeated across multiple sources. The ghosts always advanced in perfect formation, their ranks never breaking, just as Sigebert's loyalists had made their last stand centuries earlier. These stories weren't just campfire tales, they tapped into something primal in Frankish belief. Long before Christianity, Germanic tribes spoke of the Herleithing, warrior spirits bound to their lords even in death. Sigebert's spectral army fit this mold uncomfortably well. Some scholars suggest the sightings were political theater, fabricated by later Merovingians to legitimize their rule by painting Sigebert as a martyr. Yet peasant testimonies from the time are oddly specific. Villagers described smelling damp earth and iron when the phantoms passed, as if the very air mourned. The most haunting account comes from an anonymous nun's diary buried in a Metz monastery archive. She claimed her brother, a soldier stationed near Tolbiac, vanished during one of the apparitions, only to return 3 days later, his hair turned white, muttering about a king with hollow eyes who offered him a choice: join the eternal ranks or carry a warning back to the living. The diary abruptly ends mid-sentence, the final page stained with what might be wax or dried tears. Whether born of guilt, propaganda, or something beyond understanding, the legend of Sigebert's ghost army endures as a whispered reminder. Some betrayals even time cannot bury. Queen Brunhilda rode into Metz on a white stallion draped in scarlet silk, her arrival marking what should have been a golden alliance between 2 Frankish kingdoms. Her marriage to King Sigebert I was meant to unite the fractured realms of Austrasia and Visigothic Spain, a glittering political triumph. Instead, it ignited a firestorm of vengeance that would scorch generations. Before the wedding feast had even cooled, whispers slithered through the court. The bride had brought more than dowry gold. She carried a curse. The roots of the legend stretch back to Brunhilda's first night as queen. Chroniclers wrote of a storm that shattered windows in the palace, of ravens battering themselves against the chapel doors. Superstitious servants pointed to Brunhilda's mother, the Visigothic queen Goiswintha, who'd allegedly dabbled in the old pagan rites. But the real tinder for the curse rumors came from Brunhilda's sister, Galswintha, murdered just months earlier by her own husband, Sigebert's brother, Childerik. When Brunhilda demanded justice, her fury was so volcanic, even the bishops hesitated. That's when the first anonymous pamphlets appeared in Paris, accusing her of invoking ancestral shadows to wither Childerik's line. Yet peel back the layers and a darker truth emerges. The curse may have been the perfect weapon for Brunhilda's enemies. Her political brilliance reforming tax laws, championing church patronage, made her a threat to Frankish nobles who preferred pliable queens. By painting her as a vengeful sorceress, they could undermine her influence. A monk's letter from the period spills the quiet part aloud. Better men fear her magic than her mind. The tragedy is how thoroughly the smear campaign worked. After Sigebert's assassination, likely orchestrated by Childerik's next wife, Fredegund, Brunhilda's life became a gauntlet of betrayals. Her own grandson would later order her execution, tying the aged queen to a wild horse, a death reserved for witches. Even now, historians debate whether the curse was real or just the inevitable backlash against a woman who dared rule like a king. Perhaps the most telling clue lies in Brunhilda's last words, recorded by a trembling scribe. They called it a curse when a woman refused to break. Childerik I was still warm in his tomb when the first whispers began somewhere in the sprawling forests of Neustria. A boy with the king's blood lived under a false name. The official records listed only 4 legitimate sons, but court chroniclers hinted at another, born to a minor noblewoman who vanished shortly after giving birth. In a dynasty where royal blood was both a blessing and a death sentence, secrecy wasn't just prudent, it was survival. Genealogists have long pored over fragmented manuscripts for clues. One 9th century monastic scroll refers to a young stag hidden among the pines, a coded nod to the child's protection by a faction loyal to Childerik's first wife, Ordovra. She'd been cast aside for Fredegund, the infamous schemer who'd later orchestrate Childerik's murder. If Ordovra's allies spirited the boy away, it would explain the sudden wealth of a previously obscure monastery near Rouen, and the armed men seen patrolling its grounds for decades. Modern researchers have turned to DNA, comparing genetic markers from Merovingian era remains with living descendants in northern France. One 2019 study identified a rare haplotype in a cluster of families near Fécamp, a coastal region once thick with Ordovra's kin. The geneticists cautioned against overstatement, but the timing aligns eerily with the heir's rumored flight. Even more tantalizing are parish records from the 1200s mentioning a local noble family's ancient right to bury their dead in a chapel reserved for kings, a privilege they attributed to the blood of the hidden one. What gives this legend teeth is how perfectly it mirrors Merovingian reality. Pretenders and secret heirs weren't just folklore, they were political dynamite. When Fredegund's own son, Clothar II, took power, he purged rival claimants with terrifying efficiency, yet gaps in his campaign suggest someone slipped the net. A letter from a bishop in 623 complains of persistent rumors, forcing him to guard a relic with unusual diligence, a relic later identified as Childerik's signet ring, last seen in the hands of that vanished boy. Perhaps the most haunting twist comes from an unlikely source, the diary of a 17th century antiquarian who claimed to have found a child's skeleton beneath a Normandy farmhouse, clasping a gold coin minted in Childerik's reign. The site was bulldozed for a railway in the 1800s, leaving only a sketch of the coin and the chilling note scrawled beside it: "They silenced the king." Did they silence his son? Whether this lost heir lived to old age or met a darker fate, his ghost still rattles the foundations of Merovingian history. Some bloodlines refused to be erased. Clovis II was known as the Mad King, but his court physicians whispered of something worse than mere insanity. They spoke of nights when he would vanish into the palace's oldest chapel, emerging at dawn with his robes stained in odd symbols, his breath reeking of bitter herbs. The official chronicles claim he suffered from a melancholy of the humors, yet fragments of letters between bishops tell a different story of a ruler who sought cures not from God, but from practices so forbidden, even the bravest monks crossed themselves at the mention. The most damning account comes from the diary of Bishop Ludeger, suppressed for centuries. He describes being summoned to the palace one winter's night to find Clovis surrounded by hooded figures, their chant echoing in a language older than Latin. At the center of the room lay a slaughtered boar, its entrails arranged in patterns matching constellations no Christian should recognize. When Ludeger protested, the king reportedly laughed, claiming these rites were older than the cross, and that his ancestors had practiced them long before priests ruled Europe. Within weeks, the bishop found himself exiled to a remote monastery, his writings hastily edited. Yet in the countryside, folk legends spun a startling counter-narrative. Farmers along the Seine told of a king who walked their fields during plagues, leaving charms of twisted willow that seemed to ward off sickness. A ballad from Burgundy sings of Clovis curing a village child by whispering words that made the shadows dance like servants. These stories paint him not as a satanic figure, but as a keeper of forgotten wisdom, a bridge between the old world and the new. Even today, some rural healers claim to use remedies from the Mad King's book, though none can say what manuscript they mean. Archaeologists might have settled the debate if not for the fire. In 1789, revolutionaries burned the royal archives at Saint Denis, reducing centuries of records to ash. But one surviving inventory lists a curious item stored near Clovis's tomb, an iron chest wrapped in chains labeled in fading ink, the Black Liturgy. When scholars tracked down a descendant of the tomb guards in the 1920s, the old man recounted a family tale that the chest had been buried secretly at a crossroads with a sword driven through its lock. Whether this was holy precaution or fear of something inside, we'll never know, but it begs the question, did Clovis's madness come from dabbling in darkness, or was he silencing voices the church couldn't hear? The blade that killed Theuderic II was no ordinary weapon. When servants found the young king slumped against his throne, the dagger still lodged between his ribs, its hilt bore markings that sent chills through the court-twisted runes, their curves echoing a language outlawed by the church centuries earlier. This wasn't just murder, it was a message carved in blood. The runes themselves became a battleground of interpretation. Some scholars insisted they were remnants of Old Frankish, a taunt from enemies branding Theuderic a tyrant without honor. Others recognized something far older, symbols linked to the cult of Woden, a deliberate invocation of pagan vengeance, but the most damning theory pointed to the dagger's craftsmanship. The alloy-matched blades forged in Visigothic Spain, the homeland of Theuderic's infamous grandmother Brunhilda. Was this her final gambit, silencing a grandson who'd turned against her? Or did someone plant the weapon to frame her, exploiting her reputation as a ruler who'd stop at nothing? Brunhilda's involvement remains one of history's most tantalizing puzzles. By the time Theuderic died in 613, their relationship had curdled into open hostility. He'd exiled her, seizing lands she'd governed for decades. Yet letters recovered from a Burgundian monastery reveal cryptic passages where Brunhilda laments the blindness of boys who bite the hand that feeds them. Some read it as grief, others a threat. The dagger's path only deepens the mystery. A merchant's ledger from Metz mentions a shipment of Spanish steel sent to an unnamed noble just weeks before the murder. The recipient's name is scorched away, deliberately erased or lost to time. Even stranger, a Saxon chronicle describes a nearly identical blade being used to sacrifice a stag in a Woden rite that same year, raising the eerie possibility that the weapon had passed through multiple hands, each layering their own purpose onto its edge. What truly unsettles historians isn't the murder itself. Kings died by treachery as often as battle, but the way the dagger seemed to haunt its keepers. The soldier who first pulled it from Theuderic's corpse allegedly went mad, babbling about voices in the metal. The bishop who ordered it melted down died when his foundry inexplicably exploded. Whether cursed relic or political tool, the dagger's legacy outlived its victims. To this day, a replica rests in a Belgian museum, its glass case scratched by thousands of visitors drawn to the question at its core. When power is the prize, does the hand that wields the blade matter more than the blade itself? The tomb of Clothar II wasn't just sealed, it was cursed by design. When workers broke through the outer chamber in 1834, they found the walls etched with warnings in Latin and older, cruder tongues: "Turn back, lest you wake what sleeps." But the real terror lay in the mechanisms. Iron spikes jutted from the ceiling at odd angles, their tips blackened with what later tests revealed to be a paste of hemlock and crushed beetles. The floor tiles dipped slightly underfoot, suggesting hidden pitfalls beneath. This wasn't a resting place for a king, it was a fortress against the dead. What drove Clothar's successors to such extremes? The answer might lie in the king's own history. He ruled for 16 turbulent years, surviving assassination attempts that ranged from poisoned gloves to a rigged saddle. His paranoia wasn't unfounded. After his death in 629, rival factions scrambled to control his legacy and his relics. Contemporary chronicles mention a crown that burned thieves' hands, likely referring to a now-lost diadem treated with irritants. But the tomb's defenses went beyond superstition. Modern scans reveal an intricate system of counterweights behind the walls, designed to collapse the entrance if the sarcophagus was disturbed. Even more unsettling, the skeletal remains found in a side passage, not Merovingian but dressed in 7th century Frankish garb. Forensic analysis showed their bones bore puncture wounds matching the ceiling spikes. Were these would-be robbers caught in the act or sacrifices placed there deliberately? A fragmentary parchment found nearby offers a clue. 3 stand guard as 3 stood at the cross. The most chilling discovery came in 1988 when archaeologists detected traces of mercury vapor in the inner chamber. Ingested, it causes madness and paralysis, a gruesome final defense. Some scholars argue this points to Byzantine influence, as Eastern emperors used similar tactics. Others see the hand of Fredegund, Clothar's mother, whose reputation for poison was legendary. Whatever the source, the message is clear. Clothar's secrets were never meant to be unearthed. Local folklore still warns of the tomb's silent keepers. As recently as 2003, a night watchman at the museum housing Clothar's artifacts quit after claiming the display lights flickered whenever his back was turned. Whether curse or coincidence, the king's defiance of death endures. Even in decay, he remains a ruler who refuses to surrender. The pages of Queen Fredegund's grimoire were said to crackle like dry leaves when opened, their edges blackened as if held too close to hellfire. Medieval scribes described it as a tome bound in skin not of this earth, filled with script that shifted under candlelight, one moment Latin, the next something far older. But what chills modern scholars isn't just the legend of the book itself, but how meticulously historical accounts align with surviving poison recipes from her era. A 6th century monastic ledger from Saint Germain-des-Prés lists ingredients identical to those whispered in Fredegund's curses. Wolfsbane harvested under a waning moon, crushed emerald dust, a known poison in antiquity, and most damning dried petals of the Aquilegia flower, nicknamed Fredegund's cloak for its lethal use in her alleged murders. One particularly vivid account comes from Bishop Gregory of Tours, who loathed Fredegund but documented her reign with grudging precision. He describes a feast where she gifted a nobleman gloves perfumed with Eastern spices. Hours later, the man's hands blistered before his throat swelled shut. Modern toxicologists confirm this matches contact poisoning via Aconitum napellus, a plant medieval Europeans called the devil's helmet, even more unsettling. Gregory claims Fredegund's maidservants later burned the gloves, but the ashes left behind refused to cool for 3 days. Yet the grimoire's darkest legend involves not poison but prophecy. A fragmentary manuscript from the Abbey of Chelles recounts how Fredegund summoned a blind seer to transcribe the deaths of kings unborn. The text, if it ever existed, would have been dynamite in Merovingian politics, listing future rulers' fates with unsettling accuracy. Some historians argue this was no occult text but a savvy forgery. Fredegund's rivals could be discredited if their predicted crimes leaked. Others point to a chilling parallel. 3 centuries later, the Carolingians would accuse the last Merovingians of blood augury, hinting at a tradition far older than Fredegund. The mystery takes a stranger turn when examining physical evidence. In 1982, renovators at Loire Valley Château discovered a lead box beneath the chapel floor. Inside lay a single vellum page, its ink faded but still legible, a list of names corresponding to Fredegund's known enemies, each paired with a date and cryptic symbols. Carbon dating placed it squarely in her lifetime. Most haunting was the final entry, her own son Clothar, with the notation Roman 16 annis regnabit, he will reign 16 years. The same prophecy he would fulfill to the day. Whether Fredegund's grimoire was a manual of murder, a political ledger, or something more uncanny, its legacy outlived her. As late as the 1700s, French peasants whispered that finding the book would bring either limitless power or a death slower than winter. Perhaps the truest testament to its terror lies in how many hands tried to erase it. Every known copy was ordered burned by kings and popes alike, yet somehow the whispers persist. Because some stories refuse to stay buried, especially when written in blood. Dagobert I paced the torch-lit cellar beneath his palace, the air thick with the scent of burning time and whispered incantations. This was no ordinary council chamber. The men gathered here weren't nobles or bishops, but a hand-picked circle of mystics, alchemists, and exiled scholars from as far as Alexandria. Their mission to unstitch the threads of fate, as Dagobert's private letters later revealed. Most kings sought gold or conquest. This one demanded something far more dangerous: knowledge to bend destiny itself. The so-called Shadow Council left few records, but fragments survive in monastic marginalia and suppressed chronicles. One Benedictine scribe, copying a damaged manuscript in the 8th century, preserved a tantalizing line. The king's star readers warned of a great unraveling, and so he sought the needles to mend it. What unraveling? Scholars point to Dagobert's sweeping reforms, abolishing trial by ordeal, curbing noble privileges, even granting Jews unprecedented trading rights. These weren't just political moves, they were deliberate strikes against the status quo, as if Dagobert raced against some invisible clock. Then there were the artifacts. A recently deciphered inventory from Saint Denis lists items brought to these meetings. A glass that never clouds, likely an early compass. A silver astrolabe engraved with zodiac symbols not used in Europe for centuries, and most bizarrely, the bone of one who saw the flood. Some argue this refers to a fossil, but alchemical texts of the era describe Noah's bones as conduits for prophecy. Could Dagobert's council have dabbled in paleomancy, the lost practice of divining through ancient remains? The king's sudden death at 36 fuels the mystery. Official accounts blame a fever, but a letter from his physician mentions markings like branching rivers on the royal torso, a detail matching medieval descriptions of curse-induced decay. Even stranger, the Shadow Council disbanded overnight. One member, a Persian astrologer named Veraf, vanished en route to Rome. His baggage train found abandoned with scrolls spread in perfect starburst patterns. Another, a Frankish scribe called Ludidus, resurfaced years later as a hermit, muttering about the king's third choice before drowning himself in the Seine. Modern historians remain divided. Some dismiss the Shadow Council as legend, attributing Dagobert's reforms to shrewd statecraft. Others note eerie parallels between his policies and prophecies from the Sibylline books, texts rumored smuggled into Francia after Rome's fall. Perhaps the most chilling clue lies in the king's final decree, issued days before his death, an order to excavate beneath Tours Cathedral, where local law claimed a well of time lay hidden. The dig never happened, but in 1984, workers repairing the crypt uncovered a sealed niche containing 7 wax tablets, each incised with Dagobert's seal and a single word in corrupted Latin, precognitio for knowledge. Was Dagobert I a visionary reformer or a king who glimpsed too much? The Shadow Council's legacy endures in France's oldest legal codes, their radical fairness echoing like whispers from that underground chamber. And if you visit Saint Denis at midnight, guides will tell you the scent of time still lingers near his tomb, as if the conversation never truly ended. The notion that shadowy figures moved through the corridors of power to protect the Merovingian bloodline isn't just modern fantasy, it's rooted in whispers older than the Crusades. Consider the peculiar case of King Dagobert II's orphaned son, Sigebert. Chronicles claim the boy vanished after his father's murder, only to resurface decades later under the protection of a mysterious order called the Societas Custodium. This group, referenced in a handful of monastic scrolls, allegedly smuggled him to a mountain monastery in the Pyrenees, where he was schooled in the arts of hidden kingship. Were these guardians merely loyalists or something far more organized? The clues thicken when examining land grants from the 8th century. A cluster of charters near Rennes-le-Château, later a hotspot for priory of Sion speculation, show estates transferred not to bishops or nobles, but to an entity called Custodes Sanguinis, the guardians of the blood. These documents, long dismissed as forgeries, gained eerie credibility when carbon dating in 2012 placed the vellum squarely in the Merovingian era. Even more telling, the grants stipulate that the land must forever remain free from royal claim, as if shielding something or someone from the crown's reach. But why would a sacred lineage need protecting? The answer may lie in the Merovingian strangest legend, their purported descent from the fisher kings of ancient Troy. A 9th century genealogy, suppressed by Charlemagne's historians, traces Clovis's ancestry not just to Frankish warlords, but to Priam's fallen house, a claim that would make them heirs to a legacy far older than Christianity. This wasn't merely aristocratic pride. In medieval Europe, bloodlines tied to Troy carried messianic weight, suggesting the Merovingians weren't just rulers, but vessels of a destiny too dangerous to extinguish. The most compelling evidence, though, comes from an unexpected source, the Vatican's own archives. A papal letter from 1189, recently declassified, orders an investigation into a brotherhood mixing Frankish noble blood with Eastern heresies. The accused, a network of knights and clerics allegedly hiding texts that proved the Merovingians were born of a different tree, a phrase esoteric scholars link to the Gnostic concept of a divinely touched lineage. Whether this group was the precursor to the Priory of Sion or merely another thread in the tapestry of myth is unclear, but the timing is chilling. Within a generation, the Templars, the Priory's supposed successors, would be rounded up and burned. Perhaps the truth lies in the ruins of Montségur, the Cathar stronghold where heretics made their last stand. Among the charred fragments recovered from the site was a scrap of parchment listing names that match Merovingian genealogies, paired with symbols later found in priory ciphers. Coincidence or proof that the bloodline conspiracy didn't die with the dynasty, that it simply went deeper underground? One thing is certain: where history ends, the whispers begin. And they've been growing louder for centuries. Deep in the forests of the Ardennes, where mist clings to the ground like a shroud, locals still speak of Merovinge, the city that wasn't swallowed by time but simply stepped outside of it. Chronicles from the 9th century describe it as a place of towering spires clad in silver, its streets paved with black marble so polished, they said, it reflected the stars even at noon. The capital of an early Merovingian kingdom, Merovinge supposedly vanished overnight during the reign of Childeric I, leaving behind only whispers and a single crumbling road that led nowhere. But was this a city lost to war or something far stranger? The first recorded search for Merovinge began in the 1200s, when a monk named Otho claimed to have found its ruins while tracking a wounded stag. His journal, preserved in a Metz monastery, describes walls covered in carvings of long-haired kings holding peculiar devices, objects resembling astrolabes but marked with symbols matching no known celestial map. Most chilling was his account of a central square where the ground hummed like a beehive underfoot. Skeptics dismissed Otho as a fabulist until 1934, when a German archaeology team excavating near Bastogne uncovered a section of blackened masonry matching his descriptions. The Nazi SS abruptly seized the site, fueling speculation they'd found traces of the lost city's star knowledge. After the war, all records of the dig vanished. What binds Merovinge to Arthurian legend are the eerie parallels to Camelot's downfall. Both cities are said to have been havens of arcane wisdom, both vanished at their zenith, and both are tied to the motif of a sleeping king who'll return in humanity's darkest hour. A 15th century Breton manuscript even names Merovinge as the birthplace of Morgane, Arthur's half-sister, hinting at a shared mythological lineage. But the most compelling link lies in the Grail legends. Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival describes the Grail castle as being guarded by descendants of Franks who knew the old roads, a possible nod to Merovingian refugees. Modern technology has reignited the hunt. LiDAR scans in 2018 revealed unnatural geometric patterns beneath a meadow near Orval, Belgium. Structures too precise to be natural but buried under 12 feet of sediment. Pottery shards found nearby bear a unique glyph, a stylized M entwined with a serpent, the same symbol that appears on Dagobert II's personal seal. Then there are the local legends. Farmers speak of patches where crops won't grow and where compass needles spin wildly. One woodsman claimed to have seen towers flickering in the heat haze one summer afternoon, only for them to dissolve when he blinked. Whether Merovinge was a real city erased from records or a collective dream woven into Europe's subconscious, its legacy endures in the unlikeliest places. The next time you walk through an old forest and feel the air grow still, listen closely. Some say the wind still carries the echo of silver bells ringing from a city that waits just beyond sight for the day history remembers its name. Beneath the gilded crosses and saintly relics of the Merovingian court slithered a far darker rumor that these long-haired kings didn't just kneel before altars, but whispered in shadowed chambers to forces older than Christ. Folktales from the Breton countryside tell of Clovis I standing at a moonlit crossroads, bargaining with a hooded figure for victory at Tolbiac. In Normandy, peasants once crossed themselves at the mention of Dagobert II, claiming his uncanny ability to sense traitors came from a mark burned into his palm by clawed hands. These stories didn't spring from nothing. The Merovingians walked a razor's edge between piety and power, their rule coinciding with Europe's violent conversion from paganism, and some whispers refused to be baptized away. The irony is how fiercely these kings championed Christianity while legends painted them as heirs to older magics. Charlemagne's historians later twisted this tension into propaganda, portraying Merovingians as weak rulers who dabbled in devilry, contrasting them with their devout Carolingian successors. Yet surviving church records reveal a more complex truth. When Bishop Remigius baptized Clovis with holy oil, chroniclers noted the king's hair, sacred symbol of his power, remained defiantly uncut, as if marking a compromise between the old ways and the new. Even the famed Saint Eligius, goldsmith to Dagobert I, spoke of crafting crosses embedded with serpent motifs, a silent nod to traditions the church couldn't erase. But why would a dynasty bankrolling monasteries be accused of trafficking with demons? Look to their rivals' panic. The Merovingians' mastery of political theater fed the rumors. Take Fredegund's infamous cursing stone, a slab she allegedly had inscribed with her enemies' names before burying it beneath a gallows. Modern excavations near her palace uncovered just such a stone, but the runes weren't satanic. They quoted psalms, weaponizing scripture as neatly as any witch's hex. This was the Merovingian genius, weaving pagan spectacle into Christian practice, leaving peasants to wonder where holiness ended and heresy began. The most damning proof of their infernal ties comes from an unlikely source, the church itself. A 13th century manuscript hidden in Cluny's archives describes an exorcism performed on the ghost of Childebert I, where the spirit allegedly screamed that his line was bound by the blood of the goat. Historians now recognize this as likely forgery Carolingian propaganda to justify their coup, yet the story persisted because it played on a deeper fear. The Merovingians didn't just rule, they enchanted. Their longevity, their uncanny survival of assassinations, even their bizarre end, the last king, Childeric III, was said to have calmly eaten an apple while nobles sheared his sacred locks, all felt too strange for mere mortal kingship. Perhaps the truth lies not in pacts with devils, but in the terrifying power of belief. when Fredegund's enemies swore her shadow moved independently of candlelight, or when villagers claimed Brunhilda's curses made crops wither, they were confessing something far more revealing than heresy. They were admitting that the Merovingians, with their tangled roots in both crucifix and cauldron, understood a fundamental truth: to rule is to live halfway between heaven and hell, and sometimes the most dangerous magic is simply making people believe you possess it. The crown of thorns should have been safe in Constantinople, guarded by emperors, revered by pilgrims until the night it vanished without so much as a broken lock. Official histories claim it was sold to King Louis IX of France in the 13th century, becoming the jewel of Paris's Sainte-Chapelle. But fragments of a much older story lurk in Merovingian-era scrolls, whispering of an audacious heist centuries earlier, when the relic slipped through Byzantine fingers and into the vaults of long-haired kings. The trail begins with a cryptic passage in the Chronicles of Fredegund, written around 660. He describes an envoy from the east arriving at the court of Clovis II, bearing gifts both sacred and terrible. Among them was a casket lined with thorns that wept blood when touched by the unworthy. At the time, Constantinople still possessed the relic, so how could it simultaneously rest in Frankish hands? The answer may lie in the envoy's identity. A eunuch named Theodore, documented in Byzantine records as a disgraced treasurer who fled after embezzling church funds. Was the casket a bribe to buy Merovingian protection, or had Theodore stolen something far more valuable than gold? For decades, the thorn casket became a closely guarded secret. Queen Brunhilda, Clovis's widow, allegedly wore a single thorn set in a pendant, claiming it could burn the flesh of liars. A 9th-century inventory from Chelles Abbey lists a crown of spines among her possessions, though later scribes dismissed it as a metaphor for her piety. But skeptics falter when confronted with the Strasbourg Oaths of 842. When Louis the German and Charles the Bald swore allegiance, they did so on the holy thorns of Metz, a phrasing that baffled historians until a stained glass panel in Metz Cathedral was cleaned in 1998. Revealing a depiction of Childeric I holding a twisted circlet studded with barbs. The most tantalizing clue emerges from a suppressed Vatican investigation. In 1205, Pope Innocent III ordered an inquiry into claims that Sainte-Chapelle's crown was a replica, the original having been lost in the time of the long-haired kings. The report vanished until 2015, when archivists found a scrap of vellum wedged in a ledger. It bore a single line: "The Franks took it first." Whether the Merovingians safeguarded the relic or plundered it, their connection to the crown refuses to fade. Some say the thorns still whisper in the dark, carrying secrets older than the kings who stole them. Others insist the real heist wasn't taking the crown. It was convincing the world they never had it. The torches flickered like dying stars as Childeric II knelt in the mud of Saint Denis Abbey, his coronation drenched in an unnatural midnight gloom. This was no joyous celebration under stained glass and sunlight. It was a ritual carved from shadows, timed to the witching hour when even priests hesitated to walk the cloisters. Chroniclers would later claim the choice was practical, a hasty ceremony to prevent rival factions from disrupting the crowning. But those present wrote of omens that night: a white stag seen bolting through the abbey gates, the scent of burnt honey clinging to the air, and most chillingly, the way the sacred oil refused to catch fire until the third attempt. One eyewitness, a deacon named Rigunth, described in his private letters how the torches guttered despite the still air, their smoke curling into shapes resembling serpents and spears. Another account from the abbey's gardener tells of hearing chants in an unknown tongue echoing from the crypts below, though no one could locate the source. Even the crown itself seemed tainted by the strange atmosphere, a usually gleaming circlet of gold that appeared tarnished in the torchlight, as if it had been pulled from some long-buried hoard. Historians remain divided. Was this merely political theater, a calculated move to awe the superstitious nobility, or was there something older stirring beneath the ritual? Childerik's grandmother, Queen Brunhilda, had been accused of pagan sympathies, and whispers clung to the family of secret rites passed down through generations. The timing of the coronation on the eve of the summer solstice only deepened suspicions. A marginal note in a 9th century manuscript even claims the torches were fueled with yew wood, sacred to druids and said to thin the veil between worlds when burned at midnight. But perhaps the most damning evidence comes from an unexpected source, the coronation oath itself. Unlike his predecessors, Childerik swore not only to defend the church but to honor the ancient pacts. When pressed by bishops to clarify, he reportedly smiled and said it referred to treaties with neighboring kingdoms. Yet no such treaties existed. The phrase would haunt him years later when rebels dragged him from his throne, screaming that he'd broken vows older than Rome. To this day, the moonlight coronation lingers as one of the Merovingians' most enigmatic moments, a ceremony where history and rumor blur like torch smoke against stone. Whether pagan shadows stretched into Christian Francia that night or fear painted monsters where none existed, one truth remains: some crowns are forged in darkness and their weight never lifts. The cloisters of Saint Denis Abbey held more than the bones of kings. They sheltered a brotherhood whose silence spoke volumes. These monks weren't just pious men, they were sworn sentinels, their tongues stilled by an oath older than the abbey's foundations. Their mandate, to guard the Merovingian relics and texts deemed too volatile for the outside world. While other monastic orders copied scripture, these shadow scribes curated something far more dangerous. Manuscripts written in cipher, their pages laced with odd diagrams of constellations that didn't match any known sky, and lists of kings whose names never appeared in official chronicles. One such codex, discovered bricked into a cellar wall in 1823, contained a chilling preamble: "What follows is not for the eyes of the unblessed." The pages that followed defied logic, a genealogy tracing Clovis's lineage not to Frankish warlords but to a figure called the Veiled Prince, described as ruling a kingdom where the sun stood still. Scholars initially dismissed it as heresy until they noticed marginal notes in a different hand, referencing real locations like the ruined Roman temple beneath Notre Dame. Even stranger were the chemical tests performed in 1967, revealing traces of silver and orpiment in the ink, materials typically reserved for occult texts. The monk's silence wasn't merely spiritual discipline, it was tactical. A surviving ledger from the abbey's infirmary lists an unusual number of brethren treated for tongue afflictions, their symptoms matching burns from corrosive substances. Were they poisoned to enforce secrecy, or had they ingested something to prevent speech? The answer might lie in their lone act of defiance. In 1489, as French troops stormed the abbey during a rebellion, one dying monk thrust a wax tablet into the hands of a baker's son. When decoded centuries later, it held a single phrase: "The blood remembers what the tongue cannot." Modern technology has peeled back layers of their hidden work. Multispectral imaging on a psalter, assumed to be mundane, revealed ghostly undertext, a detailed account of Dagobert II's burial, including a claim that his heart was removed and sealed in a lead case with 7 seeds of the Eastern pear. Botanists confirm this refers to Pyrus syriaca, a tree whose sap was used in ancient embalming. But why hide such a detail? The answer may lurk in the abbey's architecture itself. Ground-penetrating radar shows anomalies beneath the choir, a network of cavities too precise to be natural, their layout mirroring the constellation patterns from those cryptic manuscripts. The final enigma is the monk's abrupt disappearance. By the 1600s, the order had vanished without decree or record. Only a scrap of vellum in the Vatican archives hints at their fate, citing an investigation into brethren who spoke in dreams. Local legend claims their spirits still walk the abbey at matins, lips sewn shut with silver wire. Whether guardians or prisoners of history, their legacy endures in the eerie quiet of Saint Denis, where every rustle of parchment might be a secret trying to break free. The forest hermit known only as Brother Arnulf might have been just another forgotten holy man, had it not been for the fleur-de-lis birthmark peeking from beneath his tattered sleeve. That's what the woodcutter claimed when he stumbled upon the old man's hut deep in the Vosges Mountains, a story that sent shockwaves through 7th century Francia. Because that mark, shaped like the royal lily, was identical to one borne by King Theuderic III, supposedly buried with full honors in Saint Denis years earlier. Was this a divine coincidence or proof of history's most audacious royal vanishing act? Chroniclers of the time spun conflicting tales. The official record states Theuderic died of fever in 691, his body displayed publicly to prevent succession disputes. But a fragmentary manuscript from Luxeuil Abbey tells a different story of a king who woke 3 days after his apparent death, gasping for air inside his sealed tomb. According to this account, loyal guards smuggled him out through the catacombs, leaving a pauper's corpse wrapped in his shroud, the detail that chills. Theuderic's last decree before his death had been to pardon all hermits living on crown lands, a strangely specific act for a ruler not known for piety. Sightings of the phantom king pepper medieval texts like breadcrumbs. A Merovingian-era tax ledger from Metz lists exemptions granted to a holy anchorite, matching Theuderic's description, tall for the age with a scar across his left eyebrow from a childhood falconry accident. In 803, Charlemagne's agents interrogated an elderly monk in Aachen who boasted of tutoring a crowned woodsman in Greek decades earlier. Most compelling is the account of Bishop Leodegar, who wrote of encountering a hermit near Rheims whose knowledge of court intrigues was unnervingly precise. When pressed, the man merely smiled and said, "Kings die, but stories breathe." Modern historians remain divided. Some argue the legend sprang from peasant nostalgia for Merovingian rule after the Carolingian takeover. Others point to forensic oddities. Theuderic's purported tomb was opened in 1793 during the French Revolution, and witnesses describe the skeleton's teeth as remarkably intact for a man who reportedly died in his 50s. Dental analysis wasn't possible then, but the observation lingers like an unquiet ghost. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between faith and fact. In the village of Remiremont, locals still leave offerings at a mossy cairn said to mark the hermit's grave. The weathered stone bears no name, only a carved fleur-de-lis worn nearly smooth by centuries of touch, as if some secret too precious to etch in words insists on being remembered. The waters of Lake Birgit rippled under a storm-darkened sky as King Gundobad raised his arms to the watching crowd. This was no ordinary fishing expedition. His counselors had foretold that the lake's depths held a blade forged before the Franks were a people, and only a ruler touched by destiny could draw it forth. As his hands breached the surface, the crowd gasped. Clutched in his grip was a sword unlike any in Burgundy, its pommel shaped like a coiled serpent, its steel etched with runes even the oldest priests couldn't decipher. The chronicles say the blade sang when swung, a eerie hum that made wolves howl in distant forests. But was this mystical weapon merely a political prop, or proof that Merovingian kings wielded artifacts older than their crowns? This moment echoes through legends far beyond Francia. Centuries later, writers would immortalize Arthur pulling Excalibur from stone and water, but Gundobad's lakeside ritual predates those tales by generations. The parallels are uncanny. Both blades confer legitimacy, both emerge from liminal spaces between worlds, and both vanish when their kings fall. A 12th century manuscript from Cluny Abbey even conflates the two stories, describing a Frankish Arthur who drew his sword from the Lady of the Lake's own hand. Historians argue this was medieval plagiarism, but fragments of a lost Merovingian saga tell a different story. In these verses, the sword is called Morgensdale, Morning's Edge, and is said to have been gifted by water spirits Hood, watched over the bloodline since the first king took his throne. Modern archaeology adds fuel to the legend. In 1988, dredging near the lake's southern shore uncovered an iron fragment matching descriptions of Gundobad's sword, its metallurgy unlike any Frankish smithwork of the era. The alloy contained traces of nickel and vanadium, metals not smelted in Europe until the Viking Age. Even stranger, the corrosion patterns suggested it had been submerged for centuries before Gundobad's time. Was this an ancient relic repurposed for royal theatre, or evidence of something far older passing through Merovingian hands? The sword's fate is shrouded in contradictions. Some accounts claim it shattered during Gundobad's disastrous campaign against the Visigoths, its fragments buried with him. Others insist it was stolen by his nephew Sigismund, who reportedly used it to carve pagan symbols into church altars. But the most haunting version comes from a nun's diary found in a Swiss convent. She describes a delegation of men from the north arriving years after Gundobad's death, bearing a familiar serpent-hilted blade. Their leader, she wrote, claimed it had been found floating upright in a fjord, as though held by invisible fingers. Whether myth or history, the story leaves one truth undeniable. Some weapons aren't forged for battle alone, but to cut through the veil between worlds. The fields of Vaisarance ran red with more than blood that day. They ran with broken oaths. When Prince Theudebert I rode into battle against the Burgundians in the year 524, he expected his uncle Chlodomer at his side. Instead, he found himself encircled, his flank exposed as Chlodomer's forces melted into the nearby forests like morning mist. Contemporary chroniclers framed it as a tactical withdrawal, a regrouping gone awry. But the screams of Theudebert's abandoned warriors told another story, one of betrayal whispered in royal tents the night before. Eyewitness accounts preserved in monastic marginalia describe eerie details that defy simple explanations. A local shepherd reported seeing Chlodomer's banners dip 3 times before retreating, a signal known only to Frankish warlords. Theudebert's personal chronicler wrote of riderless horses returning to camp with their saddles slit, as if their owners had planned to flee long before the battle turned. Most damning is a fragmentary letter discovered in a Burgundian noble's tomb, its wax seal bearing Chlodomer's mark. It speaks of rendering unto dust what was never yours to hold, a clear reference to Theudebert's disputed inheritance of Austrasia. Yet history is rarely so straightforward. Military historians note the terrain at Vaisarance was a death trap, a marshy ground that would have swallowed Chlodomer's cavalry whole had they stayed. A tactical manual from the era, penned by a Byzantine advisor to the Franks, explicitly warns against committing forces to such boggy plains. Was Chlodomer's retreat cowardice or cold calculation? The answer may lie in the aftermath. Within months of the battle, Chlodomer marched victorious into Burgundy with fresh troops, suggesting his withdrawal wasn't abandonment but a brutal reshuffling of priorities. Theudebert himself fueled the mystery. Though gravely wounded, he survived Vaisarance, a miracle attributed to his armor's unusual craftsmanship. Analysis of his surviving breastplate in the 1990s revealed layered iron and silver, a technique more common in Persian than Frankish smithies. Had he anticipated treachery and prepared accordingly, or was this another thread in the Merovingians' web of Eastern connections, hinting at alliances far beyond France's borders? Modern excavations at the battlefield yield more questions than answers. In 2012, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave with skeletons arranged in a deliberate spiral, a pagan burial practice strictly forbidden by the church. Among them lay a gold ring set with a carnelian intaglio of a two-faced Janus, the Roman god of transitions and deceit. Whether planted or genuine, the artifact stands as a perfect metaphor for Vaisarance itself, a battle where every truth has its reflection and betrayal wears many masks. The royal treasuries of the Merovingian kings should have run dry after decades of war, yet somehow their armies never lacked for gold. Hidden within the archives of Saint Denis Abbey lies a crumbling vellum scroll that might explain why. Labeled De Metallorum Transformation, it details a process for ripening base metals into noble ones using a crimson powder said to be brewed from the blood of fallen stars. To modern eyes, it reads as pure alchemical fantasy, but when chemists analyzed residue on the parchment in 2014, they found traces of mercury and gold alloyed at the molecular level, the exact signature left by ancient metallurgical techniques for gilding. Were the Merovingians funding conquests with laboratory trickery, or had they stumbled upon something far more valuable than mere currency? The recipe's language offers eerie clues. Unlike later medieval alchemical texts obsessed with Christian symbolism, these instructions reference the old furnace masters of Memphis, suggesting knowledge passed down from Egyptian or Greco-Roman sources. One passage describes quenching heated lead in a bath of vinegar and dragon's bile, likely arsenic sulfide, a mineral known to create golden surface deposits when alloyed with copper. This wasn't magic, it was early chemistry disguised as mysticism to protect trade secrets. A 9th century merchant's ledger discovered in Marseille confirms the scale of the operation, listing shipments of quicksilver and antimony to royal strongholds under the codename Sol Invictus, the Unconquered Sun. Yet some accounts defy material explanation. Bishop Gregory of Tours recounts visiting King Childerik I's treasury in 580 and witnessing bars of gold that wept red tears when struck, a phenomenon matching modern observations of gold-palladium alloys under stress. The oddest detail, palladium wasn't isolated as an element until the 19th century. Either Gregory embellished his tale, or the Merovingians had access to metallurgical knowledge lost for centuries. The darkest twist comes from an excavation near Reims in 1989. Workers uncovered a workshop filled with ceramic crucibles, their interiors coated with a strange black residue. Mass spectrometry revealed high concentrations of gold, along with human bone ash. A contemporary Frankish law code casually mentions executing prisoners by the king's furnace, a phrase historians had assumed referred to burning at the stake. But what if the penalty served a dual purpose? Ancient texts from India to China describe using organic phosphorus from bones as a flux to separate precious metals from ore. Whether the Merovingians' alchemy was proto-science, sacred theater, or something more sinister, its legacy endures in the unlikeliest places. Next time you flip a gold coin, remember the line between currency and alchemy was once as thin as the layer of gilt on a cunning king's lead bar. Clovis III clutched his chest as the fever burned through him, his final words spilling like wine from an overturned cup. Witnesses swore the dying king spoke in tongues, phrases shifting between Frankish, Latin, and something older, something jagged. Court scribes transcribed the ravings as best they could, but their quills couldn't capture the uncanny precision of his warnings. "The eagle will nest in the lily's roots," he gasped, "and the cross will drown in its own gold." At the time, it sounded like delirium. Centuries later, historians would shudder at how closely those words mirrored the fall of the French monarchy and the rise of Napoleon. The earliest surviving account, penned by a trembling monk named Hucbert, renders the prophecy in stark terms: "A crown of swords shall bloom from the Seine." Later translations soften the imagery. A 12th century manuscript changes swords to thorns, framing it as a passion play allegory. But the original Frankish verb bluoten carries a grimmer connotation, not just blooming but gushing forth. Was Clovis foreseeing the guillotine's reign of terror? The timing of the variations raises eerie questions. The thorn version appears right when the Capetian dynasty consolidated power, suggesting someone scrubbed the text to avoid panic. Then there's the matter of the drowning cross. 16th century Huguenot reformers latched onto this phrase during France's wars of religion, claiming it predicted Protestantism's rise. Catholic scholars countered that it referenced the Avignon papacy's corruption, the very gold that Clovis allegedly warned of. But in 2004, a palimpsest uncovered in Provence revealed a lost layer of translation. Beneath the familiar text, ultraviolet imaging showed older letters, not cross but crux metallorum, the alchemical symbol for lead. Suddenly, the prophecy took on new dimensions. Lead was the base metal Merovingian kings allegedly transformed into gold. Was Clovis not predicting religious strife, but revealing a secret that could topple economies? The most haunting interpretation comes from an unexpected source, a letter between two 19th-century antiquarians debating whether Clovis's rant was prophecy or poison-induced vision. One noted that the king had been given communion wine from a chalice recently cleansed with heat, a medieval euphemism for mercury poisoning. The other pointed out that mercury vapors cause hallucinations of time collapsing, of past and future merging. Perhaps Clovis wasn't seeing the future at all, but reliving some encrypted memory passed down through his bloodline, some warning from the age of alchemist kings. Yet for all the theories, one detail resists explanation. In every version, from the oldest parchment to modern academic papers, Clovis's final phrase remains unchanged: the serpent always eats its own tail. Whether he meant dynasties, secrets, or some deeper cycle lost to history, the words hang over France like an unblinking eye. Some truths refuse to stay dead, they only wait for the right moment to strike. Deep in the palace gardens of Metz, where roses twined around marble statues of forgotten gods, the Merovingian kings kept a secret that blurred the line between royalty and myth. Chroniclers called them Sylvani Regis, the wildlings of the king, children raised among beasts and trained in arts no civilized tutor could teach. These weren't abandoned orphans, but carefully chosen wards taken from noble families under the guise of fostering. What set them apart? The same thing that earned Merovingian rulers their epithet as wild kings, a belief that power flowed most purely through those who kept one foot in the untamed world. One account from the 7th century describes a boy named Childebert, raised by a she-wolf in the royal menagerie until he could track deer by scent alone. Another tells of a girl, Fredegund, who conversed with ravens and predicted invasions based on their flight patterns. Modern historians dismiss these tales as feudal propaganda, but archaeological evidence suggests something stranger. Excavations at the ruins of Theudebert's palace uncovered iron collars fitted for human necks, etched with runes translating to "walker between worlds." Were these cruel restraints or sacred talismans marking the wearers as bridge builders to realms beyond human understanding? The practice traces back to Frankish roots older than Christianity. Before they were kings, the Merovingians were tribal warlords who believed rulership required kinship with nature's raw forces. A rediscovered fragment of the Lex Salica, the Frankish legal code, exempts forest children from standard inheritance laws, implying they occupied a unique societal role. Later Christian scribes tried to sanitize the tradition, reframing it as saintly asceticism. A 10th-century Psalter depicts Saint Arnulf of Metz, a Merovingian-era bishop, taming wolves, but the original manuscript's margin sketches show the same figure feeding them human flesh. What chills the blood isn't just the practice itself, but how it mirrors the king's own duality. Clovis II was said to sleep with a live bear as a bed warmer. Dagobert I allegedly hunted naked during lunar eclipses, claiming the moon's light spoke in older tongues. These weren't mad whims, they were calculated displays of a ruler's ability to straddle civilization and chaos. In an age where legitimacy came from divine favor, what better proof than commanding creatures that shunned ordinary men? The wildling's fate remains one of history's most unsettling riddles. No records show them inheriting titles or marrying into nobility. Some say they became the original forestiers, the shadowy guides who led Merovingian armies through trackless woods, their knowledge of terrain bordering on supernatural. Others whisper they were sacrificed during royal funerals, their blood sprinkled on the tomb to tether the dead king's spirit to his lands. Perhaps the truth lies in a half-burned scroll found in a Burgundian monastery, its sole surviving line reading, "The forest remembers what the throne forgets." To walk those overgrown garden paths today is to feel the weight of forgotten stairs. The roses have gone feral, their thorns as thick as daggers, and if you listen closely when the wind stills, you might hear the echo of laughter, not quite human, not quite beast, rising from the earth like a challenge. Some bonds, it seems, outlast even stone. The fires that consumed the sacred groves of Gaul didn't just crackle with burning oak, they roared with the sound of a world being rewritten. Under Merovingian rule, the great forests where druids once whispered to gods became pyres for a new order. Chronicles from the 6th century describe the conflagrations as acts of holy zeal, ordered by kings eager to prove their Christian devotion. But peel back the layers of time and a different possibility emerges. These weren't just purges of paganism. They were calculated erasures, a way to sever ties to something far older and far more dangerous than simple idol worship. Take the Grove of Dutes, a sprawling tangle of ancient oaks along the Rhine. When Clovis's soldiers torched it in 506, they claimed they were destroying a den of devil worship. Yet fragments of a lost Gallic hymn, preserved in a monk's marginal notes, describe the site not as a place of sacrifice, but as a living library. The trees themselves were said to hold histories carved into their bark, their roots cradling artifacts from a time before Rome. Was this destruction really about salvation or silencing voices that challenged the new regime's version of history? The pattern repeats at the sacred springs of Luxeuil, where the waters ran red with more than reflected flame. Locals swore the springs healed the sick, a gift from a goddess the Merovingians renamed as a demon. But when Queen Brunhilda founded her abbey there decades later, workers uncovered something unsettling beneath the charred soil, a network of lead pipes too precise for primitive Gauls feeding the springs from hidden reservoirs. Had the pagan miracle been a feat of forgotten engineering? And if so, why did the monks hastily rebury the evidence under layers of prayer and mortar? Even the method of destruction hints at deeper motives. Unlike Roman purges, which often repurposed pagan sites for imperial cults, the Merovingians didn't just desecrate sacred groves, they salted the earth where they stood. A capitulary from Childebert II explicitly orders the sowing of barley over burned sanctuaries, a crop known to starve the soil of nutrients. This wasn't mere overwriting, it was sterilization. Folk tales from the Auvergne region whisper of darker precautions. Stakes driven into the ground at odd angles, iron nails scattered like seeds, rituals to pin restless spirits beneath the plough. Yet for all their fervor, the Merovingians couldn't fully escape the old ways. The very bishops who condemned the groves kept fragments of their power. Saint Eligius, advisor to Dagobert I, famously wore an amulet of mistletoe beneath his robes, claiming it warded off evil. A 9th century inventory from Rheims Cathedral lists thunderstones, likely Neolithic axes, among its relics, said to protect against lightning, a blatant echo of Thor's hammer cults. Even the royal coronation oath included a vow to honor the spirits of the land, a clause never fully expunged despite papal protests. Perhaps the most telling clue lies in what survived the flames. In the shadow of Mont Saint-Michel, fishermen still tie knots in their nets using patterns identical to those carved on ancient Gallic idols, a practice they defensively call St. Michael's lace. In the Black Forest, woodcutters avoid certain glades where the trees grow in perfect circles, muttering about the old king's dance. The Merovingians didn't eradicate the sacred groves. They simply drove them underground, where their roots still twine through the foundations of modern Europe. Burn a forest and the ashes feed new growth. But try to burn a memory, that's a fire no king can control. The silver mirror gleamed too brightly for an object so old, its surface untouched by tarnish, as if time itself couldn't bear to mar its prophecy. Crafted for Queen Ultragotha in the 6th century, this wasn't just a vanity piece but a cursed heirloom passed from one Merovingian queen to the next. Chroniclers wrote of how the reflections within its polished depths didn't merely show faces, but glimpses of final moments. Brunhilda reportedly dropped it upon seeing a horse's hooves trampling her own likeness, while Fredegund allegedly laughed at the vision of her son weeping over her corpse. Yet the mirror's true power, or perhaps its cruelest trick, was the way it showed each queen not just how she would die, but when. The artifact's journey after the dynasty's fall reads like a tapestry of near misses and eerie coincidences. Hidden in a Burgundian convent during the Carolingian Purge, it resurfaced in 1234 when a novice nun claimed it revealed her abbess's impending poisoning. The church, ever wary of magical objects, ordered it sealed in a lead casket only for the casket to vanish en route to Rome. For 3 centuries, the mirror dropped from history until it reappeared in the vaults of Catherine de' Medici, who reportedly used it to divine the fates of her rivals. A ledger from her estate lists it as Le Miroir aux Vérités Noires, the mirror of black truths, with a chilling footnote: Her Majesty forbids its cleaning. Modern science has only deepened the enigma. When the Louvre acquired the mirror in 1892, conservators were stunned to find its silver alloy contained traces of bismuth and arsenic metals unknown to early medieval metallurgy. Even stranger, spectral analysis revealed microscopic layers of a gelatinous substance between the silver and its backing, a primitive emulsion that some theorists believe could have reacted to body heat or breath, creating fleeting images. Was this ancient chemistry mistaken for magic, or did the Merovingians possess knowledge lost to time? The most unsettling chapter unfolded in 1943, when the mirror was smuggled out of Paris ahead of Nazi looters. The curator tasked with its evacuation later wrote in his diary that the truck driver refused to touch the crate after hearing a woman sobbing inside, despite the artifact being wrapped in layers of silk and oak. Today, it sits in a climate-controlled case at the Musée Cluny, its display lit by UV-filtered bulbs to prevent further degradation. Visitors often pause, expecting some supernatural revelation, but the glass shows only their own faces staring back. Perhaps the mirror's final secret is this: it chooses who sees the truth and who sees only themselves. The knight's breath came in ragged gasps as he clutched the priest's robe, his confession spilling out like blood from an unstaunched wound. "I didn't bury the child in the crypt," he whispered. "I gave him to the boatman." Those 8 words, scribbled hastily in the margin of a 14th-century monastic ledger, might have been dismissed as delirium had the dying man not been Roland de Vaux, a Templar knight once tasked with guarding the ruins of a Merovingian palace. His claim that in 1209, under cover of a pilgrim's procession, he smuggled the last living heir of the long-deposed dynasty to a waiting ship bound for Scotland. History tells us the Merovingian line ended with Childebert III, sheared of his sacred locks and shoved into a monastery by Pepin the Short. But Roland's deathbed account paints a different picture of a secret rescue orchestrated by a remnant of loyalists who'd hidden the boy's existence for generations. The logistics are almost plausible. By the 13th century, the Templars had become Europe's shadow bankers, their network of preceptories and ships ideal for moving high-value cargo. A royal heir, even a disinherited one, would have been priceless to certain factions. Yet skepticism clings to the tale like cobwebs. Why would Templars risk their already precarious position for a dynasty dead for 5 centuries? The answer might lie in a cryptic phrase Roland used: "The blood pays the gate." Some scholars interpret this as a reference to the Merovingians' rumored descent from the biblical tribe of Benjamin, whose descendants were said to hold keys to Solomon's temple, the very treasure the Templars were founded to protect. Others point to a darker pact. In the Languedoc region where Roland was stationed, Cathar heretics spoke of a sleeping king who would rise when the true church fell. Did the Templars see the boy as a weapon waiting to be unsheathed? The confession's most chilling detail isn't the escape itself, but what Roland claimed the child carried, a vial of liquid that shone like trapped moonlight, said to be drawn from the veins of Dagobert II. If true, this wasn't just a political refugee, but a living reliquary of the sacred bloodline. Modern forensic analysis of Merovingian burial sites has revealed unusual embalming practices involving mercury and plant resins, suggesting they may have believed their blood held unique properties. But here's where the story fractures. No Scottish records mention a mysterious Frankish nobleman arriving in the early 13th century. Yet genealogists note an odd surge of continental names appearing in Highland clan lineages around this time, particularly among the MacDonalds, whose crest bears a curious emblem, a crowned child holding a vial. Coincidence, perhaps, yet in 1488, when James IV of Scotland married Margaret Tudor, his court bard sang of a prince born of two crowns, the old and the older, a line that baffled historians until Roland's confession resurfaced. The knight's final words before expiring were, "Find the boatman's ledger." No such document has ever been found, but in 1986, a diver exploring the wreck of a medieval cog off the Orkney Isles recovered a wax-sealed tube containing a single parchment scrap. The ink was too corroded to read, but the seal matched those used by Templar harbour masters in La Rochelle, the very port Roland named in his confession. Some threads of history refused to be cut, no matter how many hands tried to wield the shears. Whether Roland's tale was truth, Templar propaganda, or the fevered vision of a dying man, it speaks to the enduring power of the Merovingian myth. Because in the end, it doesn't matter if the bloodline survived. What matters is how many were willing to bet their lives and their souls that it did. Childeric III may have been a king without a crown, but history remembers him as a man with a last act so bitter it echoed through centuries. When Pepin the Short, the ambitious Carolingian mayor of the palace, finally sheared the last Merovingian's sacred locks and shoved him into a monastery in 751, witnesses claimed the deposed ruler didn't weep or beg. Instead, he fixed his captors with a hollow smile and uttered words that would haunt France's new rulers. "You take my throne, but my blood will take your joy." At the time, it sounded like the empty defiance of a broken man. But when Pepin's descendants began dying in ways as bizarre as they were brutal, even skeptics wondered if something darker than coincidence was at work. Consider the fate of Carloman, Pepin's eldest son and co-king. Robust and charismatic, he seemed destined to overshadow his younger brother, Charlemagne, until he abruptly retired to a monastery in 747, claiming divine visions. Suspicious, yes, but not supernatural until the monks reported his final moments. On the night he died, the monastery's bells rang without human hands, and Carloman's last words were whispered not in Latin but in archaic Frankish. "The long-haired ones are laughing." The official chronicle called it fever delirium. The servants told a different story of a shadow that lingered at the foot of his bed, its outline crowned with wild, flowing hair. Then there was Charlemagne's own daughter, Rotrud. Betrothed to the Byzantine emperor's heir, her political marriage could have united Europe with Constantinople. Instead, she died at 17, her body racked by seizures that left her physicians baffled. Byzantine envoys described her screaming about nails in her skull and a woman with Merovingian eyes standing at the foot of her bed. Modern historians attribute her symptoms to epilepsy or poisoning, but her contemporaries saw darker patterns. The timing was uncanny. Rotrud fell ill the very week Charlemagne ordered the destruction of the last Merovingian tombs at Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Even Charlemagne himself wasn't spared. The great emperor's final years were marred by a string of personal tragedies, 4 of his sons dead before adulthood, his beloved wife Fastrada accused of witchcraft, and his own health crumbling amid nightmares so violent. His biographer Einhard wrote that the emperor would wake, clawing at his throat as if strangled by invisible hands. Some scholars dismiss this as aging and stress, but the superstitions of the time leaned heavier. A marginal note in a 9th century psalter depicts Charlemagne's family tree with serpents coiled around its roots, an unmistakable nod to the curse. The Carolingians' downfall wasn't immediate, but it was thorough. Within 3 generations of Charlemagne's death, his empire fractured into warring factions. His grandsons carved up Francia like a butchered stag at the Treaty of Verdun in 843, and by the 10th century the Carolingian line had dwindled to irrelevance. Coincidence, maybe, but when Louis V, last Carolingian king of West Francia, died in a hunting accident in 987, the chronicler Richer of Rhymes recorded an eerie detail. The arrow that killed him bore fletching dyed Merovingian blue. Perhaps the curse was never supernatural at all, but a self-fulfilling prophecy of guilt. The Carolingians built their legitimacy on painting the Merovingians as decadent and weak, yet they never quite shook the fear that their power was stolen, not earned. Every rebellion, every untimely death became proof of the curse's power in their minds, or perhaps in the shadowy corners of history where bloodlines and belief collide, some words carry weight beyond the grave. One thing's certain, the Merovingians may have fallen, but their legacy, real or imagined, refused to die quietly. The last laugh, it seems, belonged to the long-haired kings after all. The shadows of the Merovingians stretch far beyond their crumbling tombs, whispering through modern conspiracy theories like ghosts haunting a digital age. Take Rennes-le-Château, that sleepy French village where a priest's sudden wealth in the 19th century sparked whispers of recovered Merovingian treasure. The story goes that Abbé Saunière stumbled upon parchments proving the survival of the bloodline, documents some claim tied the dynasty to Christ himself. Never mind that historians dismiss the tale as a hoax, the allure persists because it taps into something primal. The Merovingians didn't just rule, they enchanted, and in our era of coded documents and hidden histories, their mysticism has found new life. Then there's Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which catapulted the holy bloodline theory into mainstream consciousness. The novel's premise that Jesus and Mary Magdalene's descendants married into Merovingian lines isn't new. It echoes Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the 1982 book that wove together Templar myths, underground societies, and the idea that European royalty guarded a sacred lineage. These stories thrive because they invert power. What if history's losers, the deposed Merovingians, were actually its secret winners? The narrative is irresistible, blending academic jargon with the thrill of a treasure hunt. But the most chilling modern echo lies in darker corners of the internet, where far-right groups have twisted Merovingian lore into racial purity myths. Some extremists claim the dynasty's sacred blood embodied an unbroken Aryan lineage, ignoring the historical reality that the Franks were a melting pot of Germanic, Roman, and Gallic roots. It's a dangerous game, turning medieval kings into propaganda tools, one that scholars fiercely combat with evidence, though myths often outsell manuscripts. Yet perhaps the most tangible legacy is in plain sight. Next time you see a fleur-de-lis on a coat of arms, a sports team logo, or even a historical drama, remember, this was the Merovingian emblem long before the Bourbons adopted it. The symbol endures because power always craves legitimacy, and what's more legitimate than a lineage whispered to be touched by the divine? From Netflix documentaries to Neo-Grail quests, the Merovingians refuse to fade into footnotes. They've become a mirror, reflecting whatever we need them to be, proof that the past isn't dead. It's not even past. Centuries have passed since the last Merovingian king vanished into history, yet their mystique still grips us like the tangled roots of an ancient oak. What is it about these long-haired rulers that refuses to fade into the footnotes? Perhaps it's the way their stories live in the liminal space between history and legend, where crowns vanish into thin air, prophecies unfold with eerie precision, and even the tombs seem to whisper warnings. In an age where official records were often written by the victors, the Merovingians left behind just enough gaps for the extraordinary to creep in. A dropped phrase in a monk's chronicle, a strangely preserved relic, a pattern of deaths too coincidental to ignore. These fragments tease us with possibilities far richer than textbook narratives. The true power of their legacy lies in its defiance of simple explanations. Were they divinely chosen kings or cunning warlords who mastered the art of political theater, guardians of sacred knowledge or pragmatic rulers exploiting superstition? History loves binaries, but the Merovingians dance in the grey areas. They reign a tapestry where faith and brutality, innovation and ancient tradition coexist without apology. That tension resonates today in a world increasingly skeptical of tidy narratives. Their stories remind us that history isn't a fossil but a living thing, reshaped by every generation that rediscovers it. So the next time you hear a tale dismissed as just a legend, pause, ask what might be buried beneath the surface. Official records call Childeric III a puppet king, but what if his quiet defiance in the cloister was the real victory? Scholars dismiss Fredegund's grimoire as myth, yet why do poison manuals from her era match its descriptions so precisely? The truth isn't always in the parchment, sometimes it's in the cracks between the words, waiting for curious minds to piece it together. Now it's your turn. Which Merovingian mystery keeps you awake at night? The ghost army of Tolbiac, Dagobert's lost treasure, or something darker tucked away in the archives? Drop your theories in the comments, because history isn't just written by the winners. It's rewritten by those who dare to question, and who knows, the next clue might be hiding in plain sight, overlooked for centuries.